Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 165, James Thomas Walker. Part 3. Now to Jeanette and James's children. Their firstborn, Archibald Lyon Walker, was born on the 20th of December 1871 in Toowoomba. He joined the Special Constables as a young man, but Archibald died on the 19th of June 1902 at Samurai, New Guinea, aged only 30. And his death notice in the paper stated that he was a resident magistrate of the Northern Division of the British New Guinea. Their second child was John Percival Walker, who was born on the 12th of January 1873, but he died on the 21st of June 1873 in Toowoomba. Their third child, Emily Percival Walker, Sissy, was born on the 4th of April 1874 in Toowoomba. In 1911, it stated in Dame Edith Walker's will that the total that was sworn in for probate was £265,340, and it mentions that one of the legacies was to Emily Percival Walker, who received £5,000, the daughter of Mr. J.T. Walker. Sissy died on the 14th of October 1955 at Wallara, aged 81, and she never married. Their fourth child, Alexander Fitzjames Walker, was born on the 4th of February 1876 at Toowoomba. He followed in his father's footsteps and was a bank officer. He married Maud Evelyn Hall in Geelong in January 1910 when he was 33 and Maud 23. And the article on their wedding says, a wedding was celebrated at St Paul's Church, Geelong on the 5th of January between Mr Alexander Fitzjames Walker of the Bank of New South Wales, Bathurst, eldest surviving son of Senator J.T. Walker of Walleroy, Edgecliff, Sydney, and Maud Evelyn, second daughter of the late Henry M. Hall of Queensland. Mr F.M. Walker and Mr G. Walker, brothers of the bridegroom, were best man and groomsmen, and the bride was married from the residence of her uncle, Dr Small, of Geelong, by whom she was given away. They had 4 children together, and Alexander died on the 25th of July 1936 in Hunters Hill, aged 60. Their children, James and Jeanette's grandchildren, Alistair James Walker was born on the 5th of June 1911 in Bathurst. He enlisted in World War II on the 2nd of December 1941. He listed his mother as his next of kin, who he said was residing in London at that time. He listed his occupation as a steward and his address as care of the Bank of New South Wales Western Sydney branch. And he was discharged medically unfit on the 25th of April 1942. He did not serve overseas and he was in the 3rd Field Signalling Engineers. He married Philippa Scott Wayne in Sydney on the 30th of October 1950 when he was 39 and Philippa 33, and they had 2 sons. And with one of their sons that was born, it was announced in the paper, and it says July the 9th, 1951 at Hong Kong, Alistair James Walker and Philippa Walker, a son, Angus. Alistair died on the 7th of December 1974 at Warrawee in New South Wales at the age of 63. The second child of Alexander and Maud was Peter Ian Hamilton Walker, who was born on the 11th of March 1913 in Bathurst. He married Jean Lee Moeni on the 25th of September 1939 at Thomby, it's St George in Queensland. Peter also enlisted in World War II on the 13th of February 1941. He listed his occupation as an insurance agent at the time of his enlistment, and he embarked overseas on the 31st of August 1941 and came back to Australia on the 6th of June 1942. He was discharged in October 1945. They had a son born while he was on active service, but he died at 1 year old, and this was their only child. The death notice stated 11th of July 1943 at Wade House, Peter Ian McQueenie, beloved son of Mr and Mrs Peter Ian Hamilton Walker, aged 7 months. And Peter and Jean lived at Rose Bay in New South Wales, and Peter died on the 2nd of July 1972 in Sydney, aged 59. The third child of Alexander and Maud was Eileen Egmont Walker, known as Judith, who was born on the 3rd of July 1916 in Sydney. She married George Dimelo Herbert Lord in Sydney in 1944 when she was 28 and George 33. George was a clerk, and it states in an article that he's the direct descendant of the Honorary Simeon Lord, early New South Wales pioneer. And I did an episode that was based on Simeon Lord and his wife in episode 75, if you're interested in any more information about that family. It also states when they married that Eileen's parents, the late A. Walker and Mrs. Walker of Sloane Street, London. So after Alexander's death, it seems that Maud went over to London to live. They had 3 sons, 2 of them surviving infancy, George and Anthony. George died in 1961 at the age of only 49, and Eileen died in Sydney on the 24th of August 2009, aged 93. Their 4th child, Jeanette Maud Walker, was born on the 14th of July 1919 at Lanover in Hunters Hill, New South Wales. Jeanette was living in London in 1939 when she was 20, and she married Ian Leslie Farquhar Mackay, known as Jock, in July 1942. Ian had been born in Sydney, and the marriage in London was announced in the paper. 2 well-known young Sydney people, Miss Jeanette Walker and Lieutenant Jock Mackay of the Royal Artillery, were married at St Saviour's Church, Chelsea today. The bride's the second daughter of the late Mr A. Walker and Mrs. Walker of Sydney, and the bridegroom the second son of Mr. and Mrs. W. A. Mackay of Hawthornton, Edgecliff, Sydney. Whirlwind preparations were made for today's ceremony, which was planned during the bridegroom's last leave. They had 4 girls with 3 surviving infancy, and in January 1944 it says, in London on Saturday, one of many British homes which had reason for rejoicing during the festive season on account of a member of the family who'd escaped from prisoner of war camps was that of Mrs. Anne Mackay, formerly Jeanette Walker of Sydney. She had the thrill of the year when her cousin, Captain John Verney, walked in time for Christmas after escaping from an Italian camp. He'd made his way through enemy lines before finally being set on his journey home. Jeanette's husband, Captain Ian Mackay of Edgecliff, who was mentioned in dispatches for his part in one of the major battles of the North African campaign, is now with the 8th Army in Italy in the Ortona section. His wife is still working in the Prisoners of War Department of the Red Cross at St James's Palace and has received many lovely presents sent by him from Italian towns. A fellow student of Mrs. Mackay during school days at Frensham, the former Pamela Roberts, now Mrs. Manners, wife of Colonel J.C. Manners of the Royal Marines, spent Christmas with Mrs. Mackay, her mother and aunt, Miss Cissy Walker. Jeanette and Ian moved back to Australia in June 1946 and owned and ran Mona at Braidwood, and this is where Jeanette died on the 8th of September 1996, aged 77. And a little on Jock Mackay. He died in October 2011, aged 92. And it said that he attended the Sydney Sussex College at Cambridge, and then immediately on the outbreak of the war in September 1939, he joined the 5th Survey Regiment of the Royal Artillery. He was disappointed not to achieve a transfer to the Royal Air Force in gliders, but he went on to serve in North Africa and Europe and in Austria until his discharge with the rank of Major in August 1946. In 1942 in London, he married Jeanette Walker of Sydney, whom he had 3 daughters, Kirsty Altenberg, Morna Winter Irving and Fiona Winter Irving. Their grandchildren include Matilda Altenberg and Francesca Altenberg. In 1946, Jock acquired the pastoral property Mona near Braidwood in New South Wales, where he remained for the rest of his life, a well-known and popular figure, the epitome of a gentleman, as was his older brother, the late Donald Mackay. The 5th child of James Thomas and Jeanette Walker was Egmont Palmer Walker, known as Monty. He was a twin and was born on the 2nd of June 1881 in Brisbane. He was educated at the Coolwool Academy and he enlisted in World War I on the 13th of March 1916. He was a sharebroker at the time of his enlistment and his father was his next of kin. His address was his uncle's property, Uralla, at Concord at the time of his enlistment, and another record states Edith Walker, his cousin, as his next of kin. And if you've listened to Thomas Walker's episode, you will notice that it mentions that Egmont and his twin brother actually lived at Uralla. He also stated he had an uncle in England and he could speak a fair amount of French. He served in the Surrey Yeomanry King's Colonials prior to his enlistment as a driver. On the 30th of May 1916, he embarked on the Hunslet from Sydney for France. He fought in France and then was transferred to the RAF as an equipment officer on the 16th of May 1917. On the 1st of September 1917, he rose to the rank of lieutenant, and his unit was demobilised in the RAF on the 2nd of April 1919, and he requested a discharge. In his army records, it states, the reason for his application for a discharge was, I wish to establish agencies in London and New York in connection with my business, being a partner in the firm Tooth and Walker, stock and share brokers, members of the Sydney Stock Exchange. But more particularly, I want to do business in New York, where I have some American friends interested in the manufacture of paper, with whom I had opened up negotiations just before the war started to start manufacturing paper in Australia. The war terminated the proceedings. They have timber concessions and wood pulp plant on the Pacific coast, from where the pulp would be shipped in our own steamer direct to the site, to be selected either in Sydney or Melbourne, and the process of paper manufacturing commenced. I would like to point out that at present, all the newspapers in Australia have to go to America for their paper. So if I succeed in influencing my American friends, it will be to Australia's advantage. And this was a reference from London on the 20th of January 1919. Dear Sirs, we are informed by Lieutenant Egmont P. Walker, AFC, that he is applying for his discharge in England, and that you wish to be assured that he is in a financial position to support himself on this side in the event of his discharge in England, and we have much pleasure in informing you that Lieutenant Walker is the son of one of our Sydney directors, the Honorary J.T. Walker, and that his financial position is quite undoubted. Lieutenant Walker has substantial means of his own and keeps a current account with us. He has securities lodged with us for safe custody and is a shareholder in this bank. By 1921, he was back in Sydney and married Violet Louisa Mackay on the 28th of January when he was 39 and Violet 28. They had 3 children and owned a property called Colebrook at Double Bay. He died on the 10th of December 1948 at his home at the age of 67. And a small article on his death says stockbroker left £104,107. Egmont Palmer Walker, Sydney stockbroker and well-known racing man, who died on the 10th of December 1948. Mr. Walker left his racehorses and bloodstock to his son, James Kenneth Walker, and the residue to his wife, Violet Louise Walker, and his family. So Egmont's children. The firstborn was Diana Edith Walker, who was born on the 8th of February 1924 at Colebrook in Double Bay. In 1934, she visited London with her mother and siblings, and she married Edward James Philip Jones in Paddington, New South Wales in 1950, when she was 26 and Edward 31. And it says Friday's bride will be Diana Walker, daughter of Mrs. E.P. Walker of Double Bay, and she will marry Edward Jones of Sassafras, Victoria, at St. Columba's at Wallara. She'll be attended by her sister, Mrs. Daniel Lee Warner of Queensland, who arrived down from her home last night. Diana's brother Jimmy will stay in Sydney for the occasion before returning to Cryon. Diana died on the 31st of July 1976 at Armidale, Victoria, aged only 52, and they had no children. Egmont's second child was Adelaide Annie Walker, and she was born in 1926 at Scrumlow, Davis Creek, New South Wales. She married Daniel Lee Warner at Wallara on the 6th of June 1950, when she was 24 and Daniel 28. Daniel had been born in England and came to Australia as a child. He served as a pilot in the RAAF in World War II. He was a jackaroo at the time of his enlistment, and he was mentioned in dispatches. It says as an officer commanding an air support party and later an officer commanding the air support section of the RAAF at the amphibious landing on Tarakan Island in June 1945. Flight Lieutenant Lee Warner won the admiration and commendation of all concerned by his persistent and untiring devotion to duty, at all times working under difficult conditions and in the early phases of the operation under enemy fire. Flight Lieutenant Lee Warner's fine efforts contributed materially to the success of air support during this operation. He was discharged on the 24th of January 1946 due to demobilisation. And the wedding notice says Miss Adelaide Ann Walker, whose wedding to Mr. Daniel Lee Warner will take place at St. Columba's Church in Wallara, with her sister Miss Diana Walker being her bridesmaid. Miss Walker is the youngest daughter of the late Mr. Egmont P. Walker and of Mrs. Walker of Double Bay, and Daniel is the oldest son of Reverend and Mrs. J. Lee Warner of Toowoomba. And a couple of weeks after the wedding, it says Anne Walker, who married Daniel Lee Warner, will make her home at Ravenswood, Tara in Queensland. And by 1968, they were running the property that Adelaide was born on. And Adelaide died on the 20th of December 2014 at Darling Point, New South Wales, aged 88. Egmont's third child was James Kenneth Walker, known as Jimmy, who was born on the 25th of April 1926 in New South Wales. Jimmy was conscripted at the end of World War II and was sent to help with the clean-up of Hiroshima. After the war, Walker was one of the early pioneers of the Thredbo ski resort, building one of the first chalets there. Despite the lack of ski lifts and having to walk up the slopes to train, Walker managed to achieve Olympic selection for the 1956 Olympic Winter Games. Australia sent 10 athletes to the 1956 Winter Olympics. 5 of them were alpine skiers, one being Jimmy, and this was the second time Australia represented this sport at the Winter Games. Expectations were high as Walker had won all 3 Australian skiing championships the year before in downhill, slalom and combined alpine. Unfortunately, while training in Austria prior to the Games, Walker suffered a green stick break to a bone in his ankle. He spent 5 weeks in plaster, but even after massage and exercise, the ankle was still very stiff and he had to withdraw from 2 of the events, the slalom and the downhill. After the Games, Walker moved to central Queensland and worked as a grazier near the town of Springshaw, and then in the 70s he established Jake Piggeries in Springdale near Temora in New South Wales. He was a keen traveller. He took his family around the world living on a ship, and they went into the canals of Europe, first in England's waterways and then on to France. He then crossed the Atlantic and they travelled extensively to Cayman Island, the US, Trinidad and Tobago. While in Fort Lauderdale, he discovered that ships disposed of white goods and furniture on the dock, and he started collecting them and transporting them to Haiti, selling some but largely giving them away as a philanthropic exercise. It was during one of his trips in Central and South America that Walker tragically passed away on June the 2nd, 1996 at the age of 70 after a ship robbery went wrong. The 6th child of James and Jeanette Walker was George Waterston Walker, and he was a twin with Egmont, so born on the 2nd of June 1881 in Brisbane. He also enlisted in World War I on the 25th of August 1916. He listed himself as an ex-bank clerk at the time of his enlistment and his father as his next of kin. He also served in the Surrey Yeomanry King's Colonials prior to his enlistment as a trooper. He sailed on the Hunslet to France on the 21st of November 1916 like his brother. He fought in France and then he was transferred to the RAF as well on the 16th of May 1917. He was promoted lieutenant on the 28th of August 1917, and on the 2nd of April 1919 he also resigned his appointment with the RAF due again to being demobilised. And his reason for his application, there were 5 reasons. The first, I tried to enlist here in England in 1915, and it was only after having worked for a year attached to our Army Medical Corps as a motor driver that I was accepted in the AIF in England. The reason number 2, it is my intention to visit some stud Jersey farms and if prices are not too high, purchase stock for my farm near Sydney. The third reason, I also desire to visit America on my return to Australia, as I'm interested in investing money in a mine in Montana, which is managed by a personal friend of mine, an Australian. The fourth reason, having lived here for some time, I have a lot of personal effects, such as furniture, my flat and my motor car to dispose of. And the fifth reason says if I return to Australia, I shall certainly have to return here via America in the near future. He also had a reference written from the Bank of New South Wales to the Army. Dear Sirs, we are informed by Lieutenant G.W. Walker AFC that he is applying for his discharge in England and that you wish to be assured that he is in a financial position to support himself on this side in the event of his discharge in England. And we have much pleasure in informing you that Lieutenant Walker is the son of one of our Sydney directors, the Honorary J.T. Walker, and that his financial position is quite undoubted. Lieutenant Walker has substantial means of his own and keeps an account with us and is well-to-do. By November 1923, he was living in Sydney, where he married Pauline McMorrin when he was 42 and Pauline 27. And their marriage was in the paper with the title Fashionable Marriage, Walker McMorrin. A charming wedding with full choral service took place at St James's Church, King Street, on Tuesday afternoon. The bridegroom was Mr George Waterston Walker, son of the late Senator J.T. Walker and Mrs Walker of Woollahra, and the bride, Miss Pauline McMorrin, only daughter of Mr and Mrs Alexander McMorrin of Stornoway in Woollahra Point. And they had no children. In Dame Edith Walker's will, with her bequests, as mentioned, Sissy received £5,000, and it also says in the estate of Dame Edith Campbell Walker of Concord that it included legacies for George Waterston Walker of £25,000 and Egmont Palmer Walker £20,000. So the boys certainly did very well from Edith's estate, considering Edith would have seen them more probably as brothers than cousins with them living with her for so long. George died on the 2nd of July 1958 at Vancluse in New South Wales, aged 77. And the youngest in the family was Jeanette Cheveria Hamilton Walker, who was known as Nita to the family. And she was born on the 9th of May 1889 at St Leonards in New South Wales. She married Ralph Verney, an Englishman, at Wallara on the 11th of November 1909, when Jeanette was 20 and Ralph 30. Ralph was the son of Frederick Verney, a Member of Parliament, and the youngest son of Sir Harry Verney, the 2nd Baronet. His mother was Maud Sarah Williams, who was the daughter of Sir John Hay Williams, 2nd Baronet. Ralph was educated at Harrow School and Christ Church in Oxford, and he joined the British Army when he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Rifle Brigade on the 7th of February 1900 and served in the Second Boer War in South Africa. By 1913 they were living in London, and Ralph later fought in World War I and rose to the rank of Major. Ralph was then military secretary to the Viceroy of India from 1916 to 1921, and then became secretary to the Speaker of the House of Commons from 1921 to 1955. He was knighted in 1928, and on the 16th of July 1946 created a baronet of Eaton Square in the city of Westminster in the baronetage of the United Kingdom. And Jeanette died on the 5th of February 1982 at Wadsworth, Greater London in England, aged 92. They had 3 children. Their first child, John Verney, was born on the 30th of September 1913 in Paddington, London. He spent his early childhood in India. John then was living with his paternal grandparents in the 1921 census when he was 8. He was educated at Eton and he read history at Christ Church, Oxford, taking a 3rd-class degree, and he spent a year training at the Architectural Association in London. John married Jeannie Lucinda Musgrave on the 29th of March 1939 in London. They had 7 children, 2 boys and 5 girls. Their eldest son, Julian, died only at the age of 8 in November 1948. John was a member of the North Somerset Yeomanry and was called up on the outbreak of war in September 1939. He was commissioned as a lieutenant and served initially in Palestine before taking part in the invasion of Syria in 1941 and the Western Desert Campaign in 1942. Verney then volunteered for the Special Boat Service, as a member of which he took part in the Operation Hawthorn in July 1943, parachuting into Sardinia to attack and destroy German aircraft stationed on the island. He was captured, but along with 2 others, he escaped from a train and managed to rejoin the 8th Army after 3 months hiding out in the Abruzzi Mountains. He saw service in France and Germany as a major in the Royal Armoured Corps, and he was awarded the Military Cross in 1944 and the Legion d'Honour in 1945. He was demobilised in November 1945, and he began to paint, and he exhibited in London galleries. A more reliable source of income was his work writing and illustrating children's magazines and books, and he had a brief period as editor of the Young Elizabethan in 1961 and 1962. In 1955 he published Going to the Wars, which was a vivid account of his years in the army, which subtly blended humour and seriousness, and he also wrote a sequel, A Dinner of Herbs, in which he returned to the towns and villages of the Abruzzi Mountains where he'd been held captive during the war, and this was published in 1966. In 1965 he produced The Dodo Pad, a combined memo, doodle, engage, diary, message book for the year of 1966. There was a gap in 1972, but other than that, he produced a Dodo Pad every year until 1992. The Dodo Pad is still produced today and follows the same structure and format he devised to keep track of his large family. On the death of his father in February 1959, John succeeded to the title of the 2nd Baronet Verney of Eaton Square, City of Westminster. In 1968, he was elected to the Farnham Urban District Council as an independent, and he helped found the Farnham Trust, now one of the oldest building preservation trusts in the UK. A number of his paintings depicting local scenes are displayed in the Museum of Farnham. In the early 80s, he served as a chairman of the Gainsborough Museum at Sudbury, Suffolk. John Verney died at the age of 79 on the 2nd of February 1993 at his home, White House, in Clare, Suffolk, and he was succeeded in his title by his son, Sir John Sebastian Verney, the 3rd Baronet, also an author. Jeanette's second child was Jocelyn Verney, and she was born on the 23rd of February 1915 at Marylebone, London. She married Andrew Thorne in London in April 1941 when Jocelyn was 26 and Andrew 29. Andrew was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the General List on the 1st of April 1932, and then he transferred to the Grenadier Guards on the 3rd of July 1933. In 1942, they had a son, Nicholas, who died in 1976 at the age of only 34. In 1950, Jocelyn and Andrew were living in Edinburgh, Scotland, and Jocelyn died on the 23rd of March 2009 at Winchester, Hampshire, England, aged 94. The third child was David Vernon. He was born on the 31st of May 1918. He married Mary Kathleen Bascowan on the 27th of January 1948 in London, when David was 29 and Mary 21. Mary Kathleen Bascowan was the daughter of Evelyn Hugh John Bascowan, who was the 8th Viscount Falmouth, and her mother was Mary Margaret Desiree Meynell. David was educated at Eton College, and he fought in the Second World War and gained the rank of Lieutenant Commander in the Royal Navy, and he held the office of High Sheriff of Cornwall in 1964. They had 3 children, and David died on the 19th of August 1992 at Truro, Cornwall, England, aged 74. So I hope you enjoyed the story of James Thomas Walker. For all of his angst about his financial worries, his children did very well for themselves thanks to his perseverance and investment in their education. And the Walker family proved to be a very interesting family to research. I was unaware of their wealth, but also their philanthropic influence in New South Wales. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.